Hello. Good morning. It's 10:30. I think I said at the end of yesterday's video I was going to do it at 10:30, although I've just seen a post from somebody else saying it was this afternoon. I have decided today and tomorrow I'm going to read you a chapter now, but from Monday I am going to do it in the afternoon. I'm going to do it at 2:30. I'll put a note on the page so that you don't have to sort of trawl through the video watching for me telling you what time I'm going to do it. But now that we know that a lot of us are going to be at home with the kids, I think 2:30 is quite a good time. So for today and tomorrow I'm going to go for 10:30 because otherwise I'm going to be late picking up my kids from school on their last 2 days. But yeah, 2:30 from Monday. I realise we'll get through the whole of The Leopard in the Golden Cage before what was supposed to be the Easter holidays. And depending on whether it still feels like holidays by then or not, I'll either, I might just go straight on to Saving the Unicorn's Horn, or we might have a break. Let's see. Okay, so chapter 2. Here we are. Now, I had a little bit of feedback from my 11-year-old son who watched chapter 1 yesterday. He's read it himself a couple of years ago. But he said, I think you sound too hesitant, Mummy, when you read. I think you need to read with a bit more force. So, I'll see. Let's see. Okay, all right. So, as you might remember, Joe has just slipped back in time, and he's at Fishbourne Roman Palace, and he's in the palace with Lucy. Fine, here we go. They walked quickly along the cloister in front of the north wing of the palace, and then down the eastern cloister. Why can't we just go straight across the garden? Joe asked. That would be much quicker. We can't walk there, Lucy said, scandalised. We'd be noticed. Only my parents walk there, and then only when they have important visitors. You're not allowed to play in the garden? Of course we are, just not this one. This is the formal garden. There would be no point going into it, even if we were allowed to. You can see there's nowhere to hide, and the cypress trees wouldn't be much fun to climb. These espaliers wouldn't be any good either, and the gardeners would be furious. We have other gardens on the side where we live. We can do what we like there. Joe looked around as he followed her. It was so hard to take in. He felt like his brain was still shouting at him all the time, that this couldn't be real, that there must be some kind of trick or optical illusion or something like that. Perhaps he was in a film set. But that didn't explain the way this other world had sprung up around him in a fraction of a second. And it didn't explain the fact that the modern houses he'd wanted to magic away earlier had genuinely disappeared. Time travel didn't happen. Not in real life, he told himself. But the alcoves in the hedges now had statues and fountains in them, just like they'd said in the information film. And around the sections of hedged lawn was the whole palace, just like the computer simulation he'd seen earlier. It was a series of big, low buildings, like four sides of a square, with roofs made with large red tiles, like something out of Italy. Along each side of the square there was a covered cloister, colonnades he remembered they were called, and they were all the same, except for the one on the west side, which was grander. He wished he'd paid more attention to the model in the museum earlier on. Then he would have known what the different parts of the palace were supposed to be for, assuming the archaeologists had got it right. Of course, he could always ask Lucy, but at the moment he felt he would rather not ask her more than he had to. In any case, he thought, the archaeologists seemed to have done pretty well with their reconstruction. They'd be pleased if they knew. Suddenly, he wondered whether one of them had been here and had a look, like he was doing now. That would explain how they'd managed to get so much of it right. After all, if he really had slipped through time by mistake himself, why shouldn't someone else have done the same? Maybe there was some kind of hole in the air, like an invisible doorway. But he hadn't noticed anything when he climbed through the rail to look for his St. Christopher. He was just in the present one moment, and here, wherever here was, the next. It was completely baffling. This other world felt just as real as his own, but everything looked different. As they stepped out of the shade of the colonnade at the end of the east wing, he realised that there was something else that was different too. Back at home, it had been cloudy and cool. Here, it was really hot, in a way it never was at home, more like it had been when they went on holiday to Italy last summer. "What's in there?" he asked, pointing to a building with curved roofs on the end of the east wing. "That's the bathhouse," Lucy said. "We go there once a week." Joe remembered the pictures of Roman baths he'd seen in books at school. They looked like swimming pools. "Can we go there?" Lucy was shocked. "Not together. It's men and boys in the afternoon. I go in the mornings with the women." "That's a pity. It'd be nice to cool off." She looked surprised. "It's warm today, I suppose, but it gets quite a bit hotter than this. Where do you come from?" Joe didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Beyond the bathhouse was another garden. This was quite different from the formal garden in the centre of the palace. Here there were bushes and trees, many of them of kinds that he didn't recognise, dotted around an enormous lawn. The lawn itself ran the full length of the south wing and further, sloping down towards the sea. There were flowers too, in huge flower beds, like in a park back at home. "Is all this yours?" He gazed around. "You could get lost here." Lucy beamed. "It's wonderful, isn't it? We only moved here last year. It took quite a while before the palace was ready for us, but it was worth the wait. It's much nicer than where we lived before." "Where was that?" She frowned vaguely. "I'm not sure. Somewhere near Verulamium, I think." "Where's Verulamium?" "Oh, 2 or 3 days' journey from here." "Walking?" "Goodness, no. With horses. We have a dozen horses. In fact, there's one of them over there." She pointed. A black stallion grazed in a circle around the stake it was tethered to. "My father had him brought over from Hispania. The horses here aren't as handsome as that." She spoke proudly. "You must be very rich," Joe said. "We are," she said carelessly. "My father is very important. He goes to Rome quite often to report to the emperor on the province. Of course, before he can do that, he has to travel round Britannia to see for himself what's going on. Sometimes he's away for months at a time." The way she was talking made Joe think of the kids in his class who boasted about their parents' business trips. "Do you miss him?" he asked. She shrugged. "Not really. Even when he's here, he's so busy we hardly see him." Joe thought of his own dad. He was a history teacher and had seldom been away, until now. For the first time, he decided to put Dad out of his mind. "I wish we were rich," he said instead. Lucy seemed not to be listening. "Let's sit down in the shade of that tree for a bit," she said. They crossed the grass together. Excuse me. "Now then, you know the first thing we need to do about you." Joe settled himself beside her, glad to get out of the sun again. "What's that?" "We have to decide who we're going to say you are. People will ask, and it would be better to have an answer ready." Excuse me. Hang on a minute. See, I told you this would be like a bedtime story and not like Audible. They spend hours editing those things out. "I'm Joe Hopkins. I told you that." She shook her head. "That won't do. It's not a very Latin name, is it? It sounds more like a Briton." "That's because I am a Briton." "Well, I'm British anyway, if that's the same thing." "Well, in that case, you probably shouldn't be in the palace compound unless you're working. And that would mean you certainly shouldn't be talking to me. You don't want to pretend to work, do you? She pulled a face. You couldn't be part of my father's staff, so you'd have to be a slave. I'm sure you don't want to do that. Joe laughed. Then he realised she meant it. A slave? Of course not. You have slaves. Lucy nodded. Haven't you noticed them? Pretty much every person we've seen has been a slave. There's one weeding in the flower bed just by that bush. She pointed. One? Doesn't he have a name? I don't know. It might be Privatus. Lots of the slaves are called Privatus. How many do you have that you don't know their names? Maybe 100, maybe 150. I honestly don't know. She picked a daisy and began to pull the petals off. Anyway, as I was saying, we need to give you another name. Joe watched her. 150 slaves for a few rich people? That was outrageous. Yet Lucy clearly thought nothing of it. How about Titus Sorry. It's fear of the Latin. It's fear of the Latin that's caught up with me. How about Titus Horatius Jovinus, she said. Well, it's nothing like my real name, Joe said grumpily, but since I don't speak Latin, it doesn't really matter. I won't be able to answer if anyone says anything to me. What on earth are you talking about? We're speaking Latin now. We are? Joe rubbed his forehead. He felt as though his brain hurt from adjusting to so many changes and surprises. I don't understand you at all, Lucy was saying. The questions you ask and the things you say, it's like you're from another world. I think I am, Joe mumbled. Well, that won't do as an explanation of who you are, she said firmly. If someone asks, you're Titus Horatius Jovinus, which means that you'd be called Jovinus, or Joe for short. She grinned mischievously. So now you are my cousin, the adopted son of my father's youngest brother. Joe looked at her doubtfully. His family is due to arrive this afternoon, she continued, along with both of my father's sisters' families. I thought you might be one of them when I found you in the North Wing. But they'll know I'm not. No, they won't. There will be lots of children for you to get yourself muddled with, and everyone will think you're with someone else. It's perfect. Joe groaned. Time travel was all very well, in theory, but this was starting to sound like hard work. There was no way he would be able to pass himself off convincingly as a Roman. He'd already said quite a few things that Lucy clearly thought were either odd or stupid. The trickiest thing of all was that he didn't feel at all sure of himself. He'd turned up in her time, unexpectedly, to find himself wearing clothes that weren't his, and speaking a language that he knew he couldn't speak. And he hadn't even been aware of any of this happening. It was like finding yourself taking a test at school on a subject you'd never heard of. It's not perfect, he said huffily. It'll never work. The minute I open my mouth, they'll guess I'm a fake. Well, perhaps we should tell them that you can't speak. That way, nobody can expect you to explain yourself. Joe picked a blade of grass and split it with his thumbnail. You're sure they'll be able to see me? He asked. Perhaps I might be invisible to everyone except you. Lucy rolled her eyes. That doesn't make any sense. Why would I be able to see you if no one else can? Joe shrugged. It was just a thought. And then he muttered, after all, nothing else makes sense. Lucy looked up at the sun. Come on, it's nearly time for dinner. Joe looked at his watch, which of course wasn't there. What time is it then? I'd say it's about 3:30. As late as that? Joe jumped to his feet. Butterflies whirled in his stomach. There's a sundial over there. We can check the time. Lucy got up and went over to a stone column that stood in the middle of the grass. "Yes, it's 20 to 4. Dinner's at 4, so we ought to go." Joe looked over her shoulder at the symbols around the edge, hoping to read a different time, but he couldn't make out anything at all from it. "I really have to get back," he said. If Lucy was right, he was going to be in so much trouble with Mum. She'd said they would wait while he went to the loo, but that was almost 3 hours ago. "Back where?" "Back to where I came from." "How are you going to do that?" "I don't know." Joe's shoulders drooped. "I guess I'll go back to where you found me and see what happens." Lucy looked alarmed. "You can't go in there again. Although," she thought for a moment, "if you're supposed to be from one of the guest families, that's where you'd be staying, so I guess it's all right." "Let's go then." Joe set off at a trot up the lawn towards the palace. "If you do go back," Lucy said from behind him, "will you come again sometime?" "I don't know." Worry made Joe snappy. "Let's see if I can get away first." But as they reached the bathhouse, he realised there would be no chance of trying. Coming towards them along the eastern colonnade was a large group of people. A woman with an elaborate decoration in her hair broke free from the front of the group. "There you are, Lucilia," she hissed. "We couldn't think where you'd got to." Then, putting on a smile and a normal voice, "And this must be Titus Horatius Jovinus, Mother," said Lucy, bobbing in a kind of curtsy. "He's the adopted son of Tiberius Claudius." She ran forward a few steps to whisper in her mother's ear as the procession bore down on Joe. "A mute!" exclaimed her mother. "How extraordinary!" She glanced over her shoulder at the people Joe supposed should be his parents. Fortunately, they were too far behind in the crowd for her to speak to them. "Well, bring him along with you, Lucilia." Joe found himself shepherded along the colonnade of the south wing and through a grand entrance into a hall overlooking the sea. Vast rugs were spread over the mosaic floors, and there were couches set in a circle around several low tables. At the foot of the couches, cushions were scattered across the floor. "It's no good," Lucy whispered. "You'll have to eat with us first, and then see if you can get back later." Joe felt his anxiety gathering inside him. "Couldn't I just slip out?" he whispered back, when Lucy's mother wasn't looking. "No, not now she's noticed you." "Don't worry." She gestured to the low tables. "This is just going to be a normal meal, not a feast. It shouldn't take too long." At that moment, 2 slaves appeared in front of them. Lucy took off her sandals and nodded to Joe to do the same. The first slave set a large bowl on the floor, while the second knelt down with a jug and a towel. Joe looked at Lucy, who put her feet into the bowl and allowed the slaves to wash and dry them. "They'll come round with clean water for washing our hands in a minute," she whispered, when they had washed Joe's feet and moved on. Lucy's idea of not too long wasn't quite the same as his, Joe thought, as the sun slipped down the sky to the west. He wondered what time the museum closed. He felt as though there was a stopwatch running. He sat beside Lucy on a cushion on the floor among the other children, while the adults reclined on the couches. Slaves wove in and out with platters of food, bringing quail's eggs and snails, spicy chicken and poached fish. They ate with their fingers, wiping them on the bread that accompanied each dish. Joe watched Lucy closely, eating what she ate and copying her movements exactly. He didn't dare He didn't dare speak to her or ask her anything in case her mother saw him. It was strange to be completely silent among so much chatter. Lucy's mother, however, seemed to have forgotten the mute son of her brother-in-law and was deep in conversation with one of the other women. Fruit and cheese were brought, and then at last the children were excused. Lucy drew Joe over to the corner, pointing out a small bronze statue to him. "Don't rush out," she murmured in his ear. "We need to look as though we're not in a hurry." Joe glanced around. "It's okay for you," he whispered back. "I've got to get away. Come on, let's go and look at that marble panel beside the door and then make a run for it." It was a warm evening outside, and in the formal gardens there wasn't a breath of wind. "Thank God that's over," Joe exploded with the relief of escape and of being able to speak normally again. "Do you actually like snails?" She grinned. "Not much, but I knew you were copying me, and I wanted to see if you would eat them. They're a delicacy, you know, fattened on milk and blood." Her eyes danced with merriment. Joe pretended to be sick. "Come on then, if you're going." They hurried around the east colonnade to the north wing and through the first courtyard they came to. "If we go this way," she said under her breath, "we can see if there's anyone in any of the rooms. You don't want to get caught." But as they went along the corridor from the far end of the north wing, each room they passed was empty. The other courtyards were empty too. In the doorway of the room where Joe had arrived, he touched Lucy's arm. "Thanks for—" He hesitated. "Thanks for having me, I suppose." He grinned. "Who knows, maybe we'll meet again." "You're not gone yet," she smiled. "But if you do get away, I'd be really happy if you came back." She gave him a little push into the room. "I'll just wait outside in the colonnade for a bit. Come and find me if you get stuck." Joe stepped forward into the room that should have had the dolphin mosaic on the floor. He'd meant to ask her about that. There had been so many things he might have asked her. He went across the room to the sideboard and crouched down as though he were looking for his St. Christopher again. He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and waited for something to happen. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Is he going to get home? What would it really be like to be stuck somewhere? It's all very well time travelling if you can come and go when you want to. But actually, I wouldn't much fancy being stuck, and especially if you think that people at home are going to be worried that you're not there. So yeah, there we are. I'm sorry about the coughing in the middle, but you know, that's what it's like. This is the website, I think I told you yesterday, if you want to go and look for the books. There are activities on there, there are word searches and crosswords and quizzes and puzzles for all of the books in the series. So if you happen to have read any of them, or you've got any of them, then you can always pick up those activities from there. There's all sorts on there, and it is written for children, and it is supposed to be quite fun in places. You know, it's not heavy. So anyway, that's for you. And I'll be back again tomorrow with chapter 3. I realised that these videos are not quite as long as I thought they were. I was thinking they were about half an hour, but they're a bit less than that, about 25 minutes. If you have any questions, though, that you want to ask, put them in the comments at the bottom of the video. I might even be able to enable it so that you could comment while I'm talking to you, and then I would be able to answer if it flashed up. I don't know. I haven't quite got to grips with this yet, but I'm getting a bit more used to staring at the camera phone. But if you've got questions, put them in the comments underneath, and then I can answer them in the next post that I do. And I'm very happy to do that. So Yeah. So 10:30 again tomorrow, and from Monday, then I'm actually going to switch to 2:30 in the afternoon, because I think we'll all have been up, done a bit of work, played a bit in the morning, had a bit of lunch. Seems like quite a good time. I don't know. We'll have to see. Who knows what it's all going to be like? It's going to be different. That's for one thing. That's for sure. Right, that's enough. Stop waffling, woman.